Welcome to our webinar for families about filling out the FAFSA. Good afternoon to our West Coast families, good evening to the East Coast, and a good day to our families joining us from around the world. My name is Karen Casella. I'm the Associate Director for Parent and Family Engagement here at American University, and it is really so great to see so many of you here with us for this session tonight. Now, some of you know that I'm actually a parent of a college student myself. My oldest is a sophomore attending a great state school. I also have a high school junior. So look, folks, as a single parent, I want to tell you that I know just how stressful that it can be to navigate financial aid and forms like the FAFSA. I am so in this with you. Now, before I turn things over to our presenter for the evening, I have just a few housekeeping items to review. One, you're going to be able to view tonight's session with live captioning if you need it, using the link that we're sharing in the chat box just to the side. Secondly, this session tonight is being recorded, so we will automatically send you a link to view it just as soon as it's available. We're also reserving time at the end of this session to answer your questions. You can certainly submit your questions at any time through tonight's session. Just submit them in the little question box on your app for the GoToWebinar. Now, there's a lot of you registered this evening. We may not get to every one of your questions. So at the very end of our presentation, we're going to share our contact information and you can follow up with us anytime. You're always welcome to reach out to me and my team at auparent@american.edu. Now with that, families, I'm about to pop off screen and turn the session over to my dear colleague, Charlene Mcdonald, our Associate Director of Financial Aid.
Thank you so much, Karen. Hi, my name is Charlene, and I can tell you, I understand completely how daunting this process can seem. And I, surprisingly, every time I say this, I can't believe it, but I've been in financial aid for about 25 years. And so I have helped countless students and families navigate through this process. And I can tell you that it's actually become easier over the years to go ahead and submit a FAFSA. Given our current state, the fact that we're in the middle of a pandemic and that families' financial circumstances may have shifted and changed dramatically in the last year and a half, I will tell you that the FAFSA will continue to ask for you to provide information from the 2019 calendar year. But there is a process for you to share with us, our office, the financial aid office, any changes that you and your family have experienced. And we'll go through that process as well, because I begin with that caveat simply because there are many families that begin with, my circumstances have changed significantly, and the information that you're asking doesn't represent what's going on in our life right now. So I start off that way just to say, yes, I understand. We're going to go through the process because we do have to submit that information. But that's the only thing that we'll require of you so that we have a basis to make any changes in the future. So without further ado, let me go ahead and get to the presentation. As I mentioned in my introduction, I've been in aid for over 2 decades, and I can tell you that the process of filing the application has actually become a lot easier by using the tools that are available. You can actually complete this process somewhere in between 10 and 15 minutes. So we're going to talk about what those tools are, using the data retrieval tool or DRT, how to obtain, for my new filers, how to obtain your Fsa Id, and that's the Federal Student Aid ID. Both the student and a parent will need to obtain a unique Fsa Id so that you may sign the form electronically. So we're going to go through that whole process together tonight. So moving to the next piece, filing the FAFSA. So as I mentioned, both the student and the custodial parent, that is the parent with whom the student lives, will need to obtain an Fsa Id in order to sign the form electronically. Now, why not just submit a paper form? Right now, unfortunately, it's taking anywhere from 6 to 8 weeks to process, and there are significant delays. So I highly recommend and advise all students to go ahead and complete this process electronically. What will you need? You'll need your social security number, and you should also have just basic information, demographic information available to go ahead and complete your application for the FSA ID. For my parents that have already gone through this process, you will not need to obtain a new one. The one that you have is actually valid for up to 10 years. Okay, so I know the screen may appear small, but I want to tell you that you would go to fsaid.gov in order to complete this application. So the site is fsaid.gov in order to go and obtain a new one. And you'll see 2 tabs. One is if you already have an FSA ID and you want to update information, you can click on the Manage My FSA ID tab at the top. But if you need to create a unique one, you don't already have one, then you should click the Create an FSA ID, enter a username, and typically I tell my families to go ahead and use their email address because typically that's a unique identifier, and then a password, and it will give you instructions as to what you need to use, such as numbers, an uppercase, a lowercase, and 8 to 30 characters. So those are the criteria for establishing a password. They'll ask you to confirm, and then you click continue. As you can see, you'll need your social security number. They're going to have you answer 5 security questions so that if you forget what your password is, you'll easily be able to reset it. They're going to ask you to verify your email address. They're going to send a confirmation to you at that email address. So once you receive that, that will conclude the process of obtaining an FSA ID. Once you have your FSA ID, you're ready to go ahead and file the FAFSA. As I mentioned at the beginning of this presentation, you will need your 2019 tax information to complete the FAFSA for the 2001-2002 academic year. Okay, so you click Start Here. From there, this is new as of last year, a parent can initiate the FAFSA for a student, or the student can begin the FAFSA. So for the purpose of the presentation, I'll show you the newest option that's available where the parent can begin the process of filing the FAFSA. So from there, you will need to put the student's information, because always remember, the student is the applicant. Even though you're initiating the application, it's the student information that you'll need to put in as the identifier. And so you put the student's name, last name, their social security number, and their date of birth. For the student, and this is important, the student will enter in their FSA ID username, usually it's their email, and then their password. Once the student does that and it recognizes the student, it'll give you the disclaimer in which you would just accept in order to continue on with the application. Now, it's confusing because there are actually 2 years available for you to complete at the same time. Keep in mind that you're always filing for the upcoming academic year. So that is the 2021 and 2022 academic year. So you're going to select that very first option. This option is required, and it makes sense. Basically, you're going to create what they call a save key, or just kind of a passcode of sorts that you can enter in to go back to where you were in completing the application if you weren't able to complete the application when you first began the process. So this save key is going to be required if you're timed out or if you decided to hold off on completing the application and want to return to an application that you've begun. So you're going to need that save key, and you know, it could be any word that you'll recall, so that you can pick up where you left off. One of the neat things before you even begin the application, the federal government has actually created a frequently asked questions section, so that, you know, the questions that you may have, they try to address right at the front of the application process, so that you'll be able to get those answers and have all the documentation that you'll need available for completing that FAFSA. So I do strongly suggest that you take a look at the questions that are there, as they may answer many of the ones that you have about completing the process. All right, now we're going to jump into the actual application itself. The very first thing that they'll ask for is student demographic information. So once again, by providing the social security number, that will always be pre-populated for you, just to show that here's the social security number for the student. Keep in mind, it's always for the applicant. So that information will be presented, and then it will ask to verify first name, last name. From there, it's going to ask, hey, what will your status be for the upcoming year, the 2001-2002 academic year, right? And so you need to indicate whether or not you'll complete your high school and receive a high school diploma. You'll have to indicate whether or not you will begin your degree program at a college or university. And then finally, they'll ask the question, have you received your first bachelor's? And if you're a parent of an undergraduate student on this call, that answer should be no. They'll be working on their very first bachelor's, and so you should always indicate no. If you are a graduate student or some other type of applicant on this call, you should answer based on your highest degree completion. And then lastly, are you interested in work study? I always tell my students and families, yes, it's a great little program. I was a product of work study, and so I highly recommend it. It simply gives the school an idea as to whether or not it should award federal work study. Whether you select it or not, we're still going to, at American University, default to awarding it to you, as working work study at AU is elective. So just something to keep in mind. Selective service. This applies to all students that were assigned male at birth. So you do need to indicate whether or not you're male or female, and from there, all males who must complete selective service in order to receive federal financial aid. So that is a requirement. You will need to indicate that. From there, they start asking about whether or not you will be considered an independent student. Now, they'll ask a series of questions about whether or not you were in foster care, meaning the applicant, the student, at any time. And then they ask questions about parents. What's the highest level of education attained by the parents? On this page, I will tell you, it's best to have each school's school code. So for AU, that school code is 001434. You can search by name, but I can tell you, American University, there are at least 6 listed, just with other countries, so it is best always to enter the school code as opposed to searching the database that FAFSA has available. One of the trickiest questions that is on the FAFSA, and this, even though it's applicable to the student, the parents are going to be asked the same exact question. which is what is your marital status as of today, right? That means that, you know, if you're separated currently, even though the tax information that you may be providing may have been based on a different filing status, filing married jointly, right? But if as of the date in which you're filing that form, your marital status is something different, that's what you would indicate in this area. So this is specifically for the student. Most students will indicate that they are single and move on to the next series of questions. So if the student worked, and I skipped a whole section because basically it's the exact same process that students will go through, that parents will have to go through. So if the student worked, then the student will need to submit the 2019 tax return information on the form. And so we're going to go through that process, but right now I'm actually going to go through the parent financial section, just so that you can see what this looks like, what the questions are. So it'll ask specifically, both for the student and the parent in their respective sections, have you filed your taxes for that year? So in the year that we're referring to is 2019. It'll ask what type of return was completed, so you enter there. And then based on your answers, it's going to say, hey, it looks like you're eligible to transfer your information that's available from the IRS using this data retrieval tool, the DRT, into your application so that you don't manually have to enter the data. I highly recommend that students and families use this process. It literally takes, 30 to 40 minutes out of the process of filing a FAFSA. From there, you're going to be asked questions about your household. So how many people live in the house? So your parents, yourself, any siblings, right? Any dependents. And if you have questions about who's considered a dependent, if you click on the hyperlink or even the question mark near the actual question in the corner, the right corner, it will open an entire page to give you a definition of what they consider a dependent. And that's the case pretty much for any field in the application. If you have questions about that particular section or the question that they're asking, or you need a definition, if you click on the question mark within the circle, then it'll open an entire page to give you additional information about that specific section and that question. So a lot of my families are not sure what to report in the number of individuals in the household that will be attending college. And for our purposes, that number is the number of dependents. The parents, even if you're currently attending, should not indicate yourself in that number. So back to the parent FSA ID. Parents will need to complete an application for that FSA ID so that they too can sign the form. Because if only the student has an FSA ID, the form will be deemed incomplete because it requires both the signature, the electronic signature of the student and the parent. All right, who has to file? This is the question I get all the time. So if your student, your dependent, earned more than $1,100 as unearned income, so they have investments and they earned interest on that investment of in excess of $1,100, then they're required to file. Or if the student has more than $12,400 of earnings, they will also need to file taxes, or should have filed taxes. And I highly recommend that if they did work and they do have those earnings, that you use the DRT to go ahead and enter that information. So even if the student, didn't meet the minimum filing threshold and filed anyway, we're going to ask data about what was earned in that year. Might as well use the DRT as well. In some instances, though, unfortunately, there are students and parents who can't use the DRT. For instance, if you were married and filed taxes separately, you're unable to use it. If you have foreign income or file a foreign tax return in addition to a U.S. tax return, you will not be able to use it. And those that file a Puerto Rican return or any of the territories, unfortunately, you will not be able to use the data retrieval tool. So if you're ineligible, you're going to need to compile all of your financial statements from 2019, pay stubs, W-2s, compensation statements, banking documents. So just think anything that I've received pertaining to my finances for the 2019 year, I'll probably need to collect in order to successfully complete the FAFSA. Now, as I mentioned before, if you are stuck on a question, I'm not quite sure how they define something, you can always click on the question mark icon that's there, and it will actually give you if it's referencing data that's on a form, it'll give you the line number or where you can obtain the information for that question. And it'll give you some tips on additional resources that can help you if you get stuck. So I highly recommend, again, that students and families use that data retrieval tool if at all possible. If you do have questions, it's okay to estimate. As I highly recommend that our families meet the minimum deadline, which is May 1 for our continuing students. And for if you're on the call and you're a prospective parent, for our prospective students and families, that deadline was January 15th. If you haven't done it, please do it now. Just because, we cannot consider you for assistance for need-based assistance, unless that FAFSA is completed. So keep in mind, I focus primarily on the 2021-2022 academic year. So if you have questions, and I know I've gone through this really quickly, please, please, please feel free to drop it in the chat, or just reach out to us. In my next slide, you'll see how to get a hold of the financial aid office. So I see my friend Karen on the screen, and so hopefully she will be joining us to tell me what questions we've received so far so that I can try to answer them for you.
Thanks so much, Charlene. There's so much information in there to keep track of. And so we've got some questions that have been coming through. The first one I want to ask, Charlene, is can you talk a little bit about how do we really nail down the cost of attendance for AU? Like, there's lots of charges, they appear in lots of different places. How do we do this?
I'm going to ask that you drop our main website page in the chat, because if you scroll down past the first 3 graphics on our page, you'll see a breakdown of the cost of attendance with drop-down menu to explain what it is. So one of the things that I can tell you is that, the university has made a commitment to try to assist students and families as much as possible, and understanding that, many families have been impacted by the pandemic. And so they have not increased tuition for the upcoming 21-22 academic year. And the cost of attendance that you see listed is pretty close to what the cost of attendance will be for the 21-22 year. There are some slight differences in the meal plan, but that's the only data point that has shifted, and that will probably be only about by a couple $100 or so. So when you are looking at the total cost of attendance, you'll notice that there are actually 7 components that make up the entire cost. So that's our tuition, our mandatory fees, our meals, our housing, our books, and then transportation, and lastly, personal or miscellaneous expenses. So those are all the components in the cost of attendance. And so for this year, the cost was $68,500, and I'm rounding. But that is every piece of it. Now, you'll notice that I indicated that there is a cost associated with housing, with food, with books, transportation. There are fixed costs. So if your student is going to be living on campus, then you will see not only the tuition and those mandatory fees on their bill, but you'll also see the housing charge along with the meals, if they have a meal plan on the bill. What you won't see are charges for books, transportation, right? We anticipate that students are going to incur costs for transportation back and forth. So that is a non-billable cost that's built into the cost of attendance. So keep in mind that there are really 2 categories of what you'll see on your bill versus what you're not going to see on your bill, but it's all part of our standard cost of attendance.
Thank you. And I did put in the chat the total cost that we've posted on the website and the link to view that on the page. Excellent. If you haven't explored the financial aid website, I swear I think everything you need to know about this whole process is outlined there. They've done a phenomenal job. So thank you, Charlene. And so if I remember this correctly, you have to do FAFSA every year, right? So we may have some people on the call who've like never done it before, but like it's an every year thing, right?
That's absolutely right, Karen. So here's the deal. I tell my students and families, if you are seeking merit-based aid, the federal government requires you to complete this application every single year. It becomes available the 1st of October every year, and you can anticipate having to use not the current calendar year information or even the preceding calendar year information. Think 2 years back. So if you're in 2021 right now, you're going to need 2019 tax data. So moving forward, if you're in 2022, you're going to need 2020 tax information. It's always 2 years back. That's the reason that I tell my students and families, you can file it now, right? You don't have to wait till you've completed your taxes for the 2020 year. You need to do it now because it's using 2019 tax data.
I think we did it as a family exercise while the tree was up at Christmas. Isn't that cozy?
I mean, that's just Christmas cheer and
right, just make it a tradition. Charlene, remind us again of when we have to submit to meet AU's deadline.
So for renewal, for our students who are currently here, right?
Right.
May 1 is always our deadline. May 1.
Okay, great. Now, here's another question. We've talked a little bit about how we're not increasing tuition, and that came out in a couple different forms. If we've got families who are coming back, well, like, does that have any bearing on financial aid? Like if they had a package last year, should they reasonably expect it to be the same this year? Like what changes that calculation?
So let me tell you, we knew, even though our students may not have been physically on our campus, that you were going to incur costs for feeding your student, for making sure that, you know, their costs for living. So we did not change our cost of attendance, which helps us to structure how much we're able to give you in assistance every year. Because our students and families cannot receive more in aid than our cost of attendance. And since we didn't change our cost of attendance calculation for this year, whatever students and families received, assuming that their financial circumstances stayed relatively the same, they can anticipate receiving in the upcoming 21-22 academic year. What's important though, was that we through the community care tuition discounted tuition 10%, both for the fall and the spring semester of the 2020-21 academic year. So you pay 10% less this year for tuition. Next year, it goes back to the tuition rate, right? Which is our standard tuition rate, right? So just keep that in mind. If you're going, wait a minute, I thought I paid less last year. That's because there was a community of care tuition discount across the board of 10% for all families for both the fall and spring semester. That ceases at the end of this academic year, and the regular tuition charge will be assessed in the 21-22 academic year.
Great, thanks. All right, so now we're going to get into like revisiting the changes in circumstances, right? So many households had significant changes due to COVID. So this is all based on like the 2019 tax filings, which was like way before all of our jobs got upended, right? So what do you recommend for a family? How do they best reflect that change in their circumstance? That's part of the question. And I would also love it if you could talk about what an appeals process might look like for AU. What should families expect?
Okay, so I'm going to try and make this as simple as possible. We use the 2019 information as a baseline, right? So if there were changes, and a lot of families are tempted to change the financial data that you're reporting, right? And unfortunately, once you touch any of the financial data that's imported in from the IRS using the DRT, it invalidates it. So we have to verify it. So if it's correct for 2019, leave it, don't touch it. Allow it to import, indicate that yes, I've reviewed and it is correct, don't touch it, and allow it to transmit to AU, okay? Because then we have a basis to make the changes that you're going to report to us. Now, how can you report these changes? We actually have an online form that our students can use through help.american.edu, and it is a change of circumstance general appeals form. So students can log in with their AU credentials and just type in the field that says how can I help you or how can we help you. If they type in financial aid appeal, it will actually appear with the form. And that's where you would, one, start with the statement of what has happened. So we need to know what's changed. So that's the very first thing. Then, based on that change, you're going to be asked for updated either W-2, pay stub, pay compensation documentation, right? So if you're receiving unemployment or have gone on unemployment, we're going to ask for that information so that we can recalculate all of the financial data that we received for you, so that we can update and amend the 2019 information that you submitted on the FAFSA. So that's that process. That's how you go about appealing. That's how you reach out to us. And even before you begin that process, I highly recommend that you contact your designated financial aid counselor. Every single student has a designated financial aid counselor. And you'll notice on the slide here where it says contact us and you see a website instead of a number. The reason is by going to this American Financial Aid Contact, you can enter in the first letter of your last name, and it will give you the direct phone number of your AU assigned counselor, right? So we highly recommend that students and families use that to reach out to their designated counselor.
And I seem to recall every undergraduate student is assigned a financial aid counselor. Is that correct?
Every
So
last one.
even if you hadn't gotten an award before or asked about it, there's somebody. That's awesome.
Has a financial aid counselor.
That's amazing. And families, all of this information is also right on that financial aid website. The menu headings are just like we're talking about them in very plain language. There's a cost estimator. There's a section for special circumstances and appeals, and the links are right there too. So it's easy. Charlene, we also, I think, have shared in a couple different formats. I think President Burwell let folks know that we are going to be able to start offering financial aid over the summer. Can you help us understand what we might expect? Like, is this really expansive? Like, what is this going to look like?
So we're excited. This is a pilot. I need to stress that. This is relatively small and very limited funding, right? And so through this pilot, we're looking to see if we can provide assistance to students and families that demonstrate significant financial need, right? So the option of taking courses where there isn't any financial assistance just is out of financial reach. So we're trying to bridge that gap for those students and families. We are looking to assess financial need the same way that we would within an academic year, in that the families will need to, one, file the 2021-2022 FAFSA. Two, if students are looking for consideration for institutional grant funding for the summer, they'll need to enroll in at least 6 credits, right? They'll have to be making satisfactory academic progress, and that's the case for any type of assistance for any student. So satisfactory academic progress is simply an audit that we conduct at the end of the year to make sure that students are meeting the minimum criteria, the minimum standards set for their particular award. So for those who are receiving strictly need-based assistance, that means that a student has a cumulative GPA of at least a 2.0, and that they're successfully completing at least 67% of the courses that they pretend to. That's the basic standard. So we do that check for every single student. And if a student is a recipient of a merit scholarship, they have to ensure that they have a minimum cumulative GPA of a 3.0. 3.0, that changed a few years ago. Just keep 3.0 in your mind. That is the minimum cumulative GPA requirement. We do not round. So if a student has a 2.99999, unfortunately it's a 2.9. So that's one thing. And then also there is no minimum credit completion requirement for our merit aid recipients. However, the award is only for up to 4 years or 8 semesters of undergraduate study. So students still need to make sure that they're completing at least, 15 credits per semester, so that at the end of the 4 years or 8 semesters, they'll have completed 120 credits.
I'm so glad you mentioned that the full-time credit load, the 15 credits, because I think it's important for families to recognize, like, this setup that we've had where we're doing this remote learning, a lot of students are struggling with it. And so one of the options they consider is maybe they should take less credits, right, if they're at home. And so I think your point helps to underscore why it's important that the students really talk to their academic advisors before they drop classes, because it sounds like it could have an impact on financial aid. Yeah.
It does. And I will tell you that we recognize that changing the mode of instruction does impact learning. And so for those that have contacted our office, we have been able to make an exception and allow institutional funding that typically isn't available for those who are not enrolled at least full-time, which is 12 credits, to receive a prorated portion of their award, given, these circumstances. I will tell you in the fall, the expectation, though, is that we will return back to requiring that students who receive AU funding, either merit or grant funding, be enrolled at least in 12 credits in order for those funds to credit and disperse to student accounts. That's an exception that we have made, in the past year, but we anticipate going back to our standards and our policy requiring for funding.
12 credits. Okay. I have some other questions that came in from some families around like some international issues. I'm going to come back to that in just one second. But you also were just talking about, you mentioned that sometimes you got to audit, right? These accounts. So that makes me think that we should talk a little bit about the notification process, right? Because students are applying by May 1 if they're returning. And then everyone is chomping at the bit, wondering, when do I get my award letter? Charlene, when do they get their award letter? Why does it take that long?
So I will tell you, here's the deal. And I'm so glad you mentioned this, Karen, because I always forget for my parents who were, parents of freshmen last year, they were like, yes, by March, I knew. So wait, we're in March now. Where's my letter? And I do apologize. We're required by the federal government to conduct an audit at the end of every single academic year. And that audit can't be conducted until the spring semester is ended. So the spring semester doesn't end till 2 weeks into May. Grades have to be reported, and once those are reported, that's when we're able to make our assessment to go ahead and conduct the audit and determine exactly how much students and families are eligible for, because then we'll make the determination of whether or not they're meeting the minimum standards, or if they are not, we'll notify them and say, hey, it looks like you haven't met these standards. Here are your options. Tell us what happened. You can appeal so that we can make that determination for you.
Excellent, thank you. I think that helps because it feels very unsettling. Like, wait, it's summer. How come I don't know yet what's going on? Okay. So I had some questions. Like, one was, if we've got two parents custodial, but maybe one parent doesn't have a social security number, or maybe one parent is actually not a U.S. citizen, and in fact, one of our families here has been asking, I don't think they're the only ones in this boat where one of the parents, their wages are overseas, right? They're not being paid through the U.S. So I don't know how that kind of stuff factors in, and it sounds kind of complicated. So I'm also wondering, like, where do you go with these tough questions on the FAFSA? Like, do they have a helpline? Like, how do you figure this out?
Once again, I will say two things. One, the Department of Education acknowledges that family dynamics are very different for each student, and so we are very much, especially at AU, familiar with having families with foreign income or individuals who may not necessarily have a social security number. For those that do not have a social security number, enter zeros. It actually instructs you to just enter zeros. And provide us with the rest of your demographic information, right? So that's easily taken care of. And on the form, it will ask specifically, do you have US income? If you do, how did you file? If not, do you have foreign income and the source of that foreign income? And then you can indicate the dollar amount there. And if we need additional information, we will contact you and simply say, hey, can you provide us additional information regarding, either the conversion of the currency to US, if it's a foreign income exclusion that happened, we may need additional information, but we are actually well versed in that. And so we help our students and families navigate that process all the time. And so I go back to every last one of you has an assigned financial aid counselor. If you have these questions, please don't go it alone. Feel free to give us a call. Know though that it is a busy time. And I know that you may want an immediate answer. Like Karen indicated, more than likely it is on our website. We do try to go very much in depth to try and help families understand different circumstances, but please contact us. and we will get back to you. Typically, it does take us 2 business days. So just keep in your mind, hey, I may want an immediate answer right now, but given the volume and the number of students and families that we're trying to help, it may actually take us a couple of days. For most, though, you'll get a call back within that 2 days.
Excellent, thanks. And I know something of the volume because I get a lot of messages that come to my inbox too with questions about bills. And I'll share with this group, like the student bills are confidential. So that's not something that my team and I can help provide detailed answers with. That's why we really want you to go through your financial aid advisor. And hopefully everybody on this call, their students have already worked with them to give them proxy access. But if you're not able to view the student bills, you can email me later. I can send you the instructions that you can discuss with your students so that you can detailed breakdowns of these bills.
Thank you, Karen. Any more questions?
Let's see. Is my camera back? Can we see me?
No, that's okay. So I can see a still you, looking lovely, but I can hear your voice. So
Okay.
and I'm muted, so forgive me.
All right, sorry about that, folks. Charlene, can we check in on, there's some folks like maybe there's been a shift in custodial parent over the course of one year to the next. Do they need to get a new ID number? And is that pretty easy?
So I will tell you, though the determination for custodial parent is typically made based on whom the student lived with most, right? So if it's the same for both parents, then really, with the continuity of award and so on and so forth, it should be the same parent. If it's not, though, then yes, the custodial parent will need to complete the application for an FSA ID if they haven't already, so that they can sign the form. And you bring a very good point. And I will say this. I understand, I think, better than most, the complicated nature of family dynamics. And so I will say this. We will try to, within the confines of the rules that we have, help our students and families to best represent what their circumstances look like. However, there are fundamental principles and rules that we have to adhere to when making a determination of a family's contribution, right? And part of that is that there is an expectation that both the custodial and the non-custodial parent will be contributing towards the student's education. So keep that in mind. So even though on the FAFSA, it only captures the custodial parent information, we do ask about the non-custodial contribution.
Excellent, thank you. I'm going to rewind way back to the beginning concepts about our financial aid here, Charlene. I get a lot of questions about this, excuse me, all year. We have been really talking just about the need-based, but can I ask you to just kind of explain to families how the merit-based works and where they would find more information or what to expect?
I'm happy to. I will tell you the reason we focus so much on the need-based assistance today is because that's the aid that our office is responsible for making the determination and the awarding of those funds. So need-based assistance is all that we do, right? Now, we're also the administrators of merit aid. So once a student has received an award through, say, the admissions process, then our office is responsible for ensuring that students meet the minimum standards for keeping that award, right? So merit funding, the bulk of merit funding is awarded through the admissions process, right? And students who have been awarded, those awards are typically for our first year students, valid for 4 years, 8 semesters, and then for most of our transfer population, it's 2 years, 4 semesters. So just keep that in mind, that those are the time frame for receipt of the awards. They're renewable for up to that, that limit. In some cases, students will receive other merit-based awards that are available either through an application process on a school's, on their specific program or school's website. So it'll list for undergraduate students, the following donor or restricted scholarships are available for those who are studying X, Y, and Z, right? So that information is listed through the academic units and is publicly listed on their sites if available, right? If not listed, that means that they don't have the funding available, right? We have an office strictly dedicated to assisting students and families who are seeking to be competitive with our national awards. As many of you may already know, we have any number of Truman, Pickering, and very prestigious national awards. And so we do have an office that works with our students to ensure that they're sending forth the very best application possible for consideration for these national awards. And so I do tell my students and families, look, most of these though are geared towards our upper level students and for continued education, either professional studies or graduate school. So keep in mind that we do have an office. It's dedicated towards that. It's within the Career Center. And so I do often refer to them because for our high achieving students that may be nationally competitive, that is definitely a resource that I direct my students. And then lastly, we work very closely with the Office of Development to administer what we call donor or restricted scholarships. These scholarships are really based on the generosity of our donors and friends of AU. They set the criteria for the award, right? And so based on that criteria, eligible students are notified. And so that process typically happens in the spring. And again, there usually isn't an application process simply because the donor indicates the criteria and we're able to basically review all of our students to determine if they've met the criteria of the award and we'll notify them if they do.
Excellent, thank you. Families, I'm conscious of our time and we're about to get ready to close, but I have a comment and then I'll see what Charlene has for closing advice. And one is, I got to work with this team in financial aid and across campus. COVID really threw a lot of things out of whack for so many families. And I mean, it was amazing. And I feel honored to have had the chance to work with colleagues who worked around the clock and checked under every rock and stone to see what we could do to make sure that our students could continue with their studies and to support them. And so families, I just feel like I need to just echo that in Charlene and her team, you really have some phenomenal advocates who are here to help you figure out how to make this possible. I mean, like 100%, they are here for you. And so with that in mind, I want to ask Charlene, like, what kind of parting advice would you have for families? This is a pretty anxious kind of process. What should they keep in mind?
I always tend to share a bit of my story just to help families understand the level of commitment that you're going to find with our staff, right? I will tell you, we're committed to hiring people who want to help. Our motto is, we are here to help. That is our primary focus, right? And I will tell you, I was a student whose parents did not have an opportunity to attend college. So I was first generation college. And so this process was completely foreign to me. And I happened to secure my very first job on my very first day as an undergraduate student in the financial aid office. And I made it a career because this is my way of paying it forward. If it were not for these individuals that cared enough to make sure that I could receive sufficient financing and understood how to navigate the process so that I could successfully complete my education and be in a stronger position for it, then I wouldn't be here. And so that's the reason that we're all committed to helping you. And we know that this process is difficult, right? And that's why there's a whole office dedicated to helping our students and families navigate it. So please, if you get stuck, if you need help, don't hesitate, contact us.
Thanks. A number of families on this call tonight have asked some very specific questions about their student's situation or their unique circumstance. And so it does seem like we keep going back to this, but having you or your students start with that email, just sending it to the financialaid@american.edu is really the only thing you have to remember. We'll figure it out from there and make sure you get connected to the right person who can help you. So just bookmark that. So this is about whether you've got an appeal in process or you're not even sure if it would count as an appeal. Like, those are the folks to talk to. Families, I want to thank you again for all that you do to support your student and for taking the time tonight with us. Please feel free at any time to reach out again. Charlene is available through Financial Aid at American. And you probably remember that I'm at auparent@american.edu. I'm going to drop that in the box again for you now. And once again, families, tonight's session was recorded, so we'll send a copy of it out to you after this is over. And we look forward to seeing you again. Thank you again so much and have a great night.
Thank you so much, and take care and be well.